Hello and welcome to Meet a Columban. I'm Fr Jim Mulroney and I'm your host, and my guest in this segment is Fr Paul Glynn. Now, Paul is the director of the Columban region in the Philippines, and he has worked in that country since he was a student. He went there the first time in 1992 and then returned again after his ordination to the priesthood in 1995. So welcome to Meet a Columban, Paul.
Thank you very much.
This year is the 500th anniversary of the coming of the Christian faith to the Philippines. Could you tell us something of the story, both of its initial arrival and then also of what is really quite a long history of faith in an Asian country?
Yeah, I think most of us learned at school that Magellan was the first to circumnavigate the globe, which in fact is not true, because he was halfway around the world when he arrived in Cebu in the Philippines, and he got into a local fight between two chiefs, and one of them ended up killing him. So they continued on their journey back to Spain without him. So he didn't actually circumnavigate the globe, but it was his group of people. And when he arrived in the Philippines, he spent a bit of time around here, and he had with him a chaplain. And on Easter Sunday, 1521, they celebrated Mass on the island of Limasawa, which is right in the middle of the Philippines. And then they went from there to Cebu, and story has it that they baptized quite a few people in Cebu. And then they left, and in 1565, the Spanish had decided then to colonize the Philippines, and they sent another guy, Legazpi. And when he arrived back in Cebu, after burning the town down because the people didn't want him, they discovered this statue of what they call the Santo Niño, or what some of us call the Child of Prague. And that's a symbol of the coming of Christianity to the Philippines, because they reckon it was left behind by Magellan's people. So this year we're celebrating 500 years of the arrival of Magellan and the celebration of the first Mass in Limasawa Island on Easter Sunday. And as you said, things have moved a long way since 1521. I think by and large, this year in the celebration of 500 years, the bishops of the country and other groups, Catholic groups, have been talking a lot about, the light and the shadow in terms of the coming of Christianity to the Philippines. It came with the colonizers. There was a lot of sadness and grief and persecution and all sorts of things during the colonial era, but that the seed of faith came with the colonizers. And after 500 years, that seed has grown into something. It's no longer Spanish colonial Catholicism, it's now Filipino Catholicism. So it's sort of 500 years, the celebration or the commemoration is looking at, how faith has developed, how the Catholic faith has developed over those 500 years, and how it has come of age, and how we are learning to sort of let go of what the negative parts of the faith were, and to sort of build on what the true Christian faith the Spanish brought is.
Would it be accurate to say that a typically Filipino faith has developed, or a Filipino expression of faith?
I think it's more a Filipino expression of faith, which is still, when you look at it from at the surface, in the Philippines, we have an awful lot of Catholic practices that are very much associated with Spanish Christianity, Spanish Catholicism, fiestas, processions, statues, all those things. So a lot of these celebrations are still quite similar to what the Spanish brought. But I think there's a particular Filipino understanding of faith, and Filipinos who have faith you know, they practice their faith and they treasure their faith as Filipinos and not as Spaniards. So I think maybe some of the external look similar to Spain or Latin America, but underneath that, it's very much an Asian expression and treasuring of Catholicism.
Now, we often hear the Philippines referred to or described as the only Catholic country in Asia. And certainly it's the only country in Asia with a high percentage, 90-something%, I believe, of the people who have been baptized. But then we also see in the practice quite a dichotomy. Like we've read in Australia about the drug wars that the President Duterte has been carrying out, almost what you might call indiscriminate murder of people, which is hardly part of being Catholic. And yet it's a practice which has received quite a lot of support from people who call themselves Catholic. So is there some kind of a dichotomy has developed between what is perceived as maybe the only way to do things? Is it that the Philippines is a violent country, or somehow or other the culture has a violent element in it, which leads people to believe that violence is the only way that we can solve problems?
Yeah, I think that's a very complex question. I think one dimension of all of this, and I speak as an Irishman who, we were part of the British colonial enterprise, no matter how you look at it.
Yeah.
And anything that's introduced by the colonizer, there's a sort of a love-hate relationship with that, whatever is introduced by those who are colonized. And I think the Catholicism came with the Spanish colonization, and I think there was an ambivalence, among a lot of Filipinos towards the faith. So on one level, it's sort of faith in Jesus and following Christ. And so I think on average, you say about 90% of people are baptized, but the numbers are increasing, but they reckon about 25% of people, maybe 20 in some places, 10 in some cities, practice going to Mass on Sunday. So when you're baptized, there's also a cultural dimension to it. It was a colonial institution, introduced the church, and you basically couldn't get a job in the Spanish era unless you were baptized. So there's still some of those trappings. Another thing, I came to the Philippines in 1990 and it was very shortly after the dictatorship of Ferdinand Marcos. And the country was bankrupt at the time because Marcos had basically looted the country. Another thing Marcos did, I think, was increased the level of violence in the country and justification of violence. In other words, it was a dictatorship. The government sponsored violence. And I think ever since that, the country has never really recovered from that level of violence introduced during the Marcos dictatorship. Then it sort of was back to the reality of having to pick the country back up again, the country being bankrupt, the country continuing to be bankrupt because we're still paying back some of the debts that Marcos accrued. So I think because the country is struggling economically, because so many people have to work overseas, also the interference by China, the proliferation of drugs, all these sorts of things, people, I think as we see in world leaders all over the place, people want a quick fix. And I think Duterte was the quick fix. Ever since I came to the country, I've heard people saying, oh, Filipinos are so undisciplined. We need another dictator like Marcos. So I think it's something about the quick fix. Also, the fake news being promulgated by Marcos's son, who's running for president next year, sort of this false notion of the Marcos dictatorship being the glory years, you know, and people harking back to that and harking back to the strong leader who will, you know, discipline us and all that sort of thing. So I think all those things go into the mix, really, and that's why Duterte is popular. But my experience among the 25% who go to mass every Sunday, he might be popular with maybe about 7 or 8% of those people, but the majority of people who are practicing Catholics can see the horror of these killings and just the horror of the style of government he is running at the moment.
And also, I've heard it said by Filipino people working abroad that one of the reasons they felt compelled to leave the Philippines and seek work abroad was it didn't really matter what you achieved. Something or someone would destroy it. It may be the rats eating the rice, it may be the pests devouring the crop before it's ready to harvest. It might be a typhoon, it might be a flood, it might be a drought. It might be the military coming through and stealing your chickens to cook for their dinner or steal your pig. But it didn't seem to matter what you achieved or how much you managed to build up. Eventually something or someone would destroy it. Is this a typical way that many people live? I know it's a country of vast gap between rich and poor, and the poor seem to proliferate at a much greater rate than the wealthy or the rich people. But how does that dynamic between rich and poor play out, and how does the church in the Philippines seek to address that?
Yes, I think that's probably a good description, you know, whether that you heard from Filipinos overseas. And to a large extent, apart from the natural disasters and rats and things like that, I suppose, put crudely, it's the rich who destroy the hopes of the poor in many senses. It's not what you know, it's who you know. You know, you might be a very good doctor or professor, you know, engineer or professor, but unless you know some politician, you won't get the top job. Some half-wit who happens to be on good terms with the powerful politician is going to end up in the job. So there's that also that level of mediocrity that comes with that. The church, during the time of Marcos, the church was very, very much outspoken against the Marcos dictatorship. But one thing that Marcos introduced, probably partly, you know, with the help of the CIA and other groups like that, we have to remember, you know, in the 80s, it was still the Cold War, all that sort of thing. What Marcos successfully introduced was that if you speak out for the rights of the poor or condemn the injustices of the rich, you're a communist. And that's what Duterte is doing in spades at the moment. Anybody who speaks out is a communist. I was speaking to a Marist sister yesterday whose fellow sister, another Marist sister, had to go leave the country and live in Rome because she was the secretary of the Association of Catholic Religious in Mindanao, and they spoke out against the persecution of the indigenous peoples. The indigenous peoples are being accused by the Duterte government of supporting communism, and a lot of them are being harassed. And this group spoke out against that harassment. And then she learned from somebody who knew somebody in intelligence that her name was on the wanted list for being a communist. The sisters decided that the only way she would be safe was to move to Rome. There's also a redemptorist priest in Davao who basically, when Duterte was mayor in Davao, he was responsible for killing a lot of street children, petty thieves, minor drug addicts and that sort of thing. So this Redemptorist priest noticed that a lot of young people were coming to his church, being buried from his church. So he just started taking the list of all these young people, and then he discovered that most of these had been killed by Duterte's cronies or Duterte's gangs. And he eventually brought the case to the human rights people during the time of the last president. And one of the first things then that Duterte did when he became president was to put this Redemptorist on the wanted list. And they advised him that he needed to leave the country. So he's also in Rome, and he now has a job with the Justice and Peace or something with the Redemptorists in Rome, but he had to flee. So, and also you have the Australian Sister of Zion, Patricia Fox,
Yes.
who had to leave the country because she was working with groups who were highlighting exploitation of factory workers, farmers, and that they weren't getting just wages and things like that. So she was accused of being a communist and she was deported. So we are trying to do what we can. It's very difficult as foreigners because there's a law in the Philippines that if you're a foreigner, you're not allowed to take part in any public rally or protest or anything like that. So we sort of have to work in the background and support groups who are speaking out, non-violent advocacy, making people aware of the injustices that are going on in the country.
Which leaves the church, I think, in a fairly invidious position. I think our older viewers will remember Father Brian Gore and the Negros Nine back in the 1980s, when he was really caught in a pincer movement of that very dynamic that you're speaking about now. And it indicates that either not much has changed or things change extremely slowly.
What I have noticed in the last, now it's coming up to the next elections next year, we have elections for a new president, and Duterte's daughter is running as vice president with Marcos's son. So it's, it's going to, if they win, it's going to go from bad to worse. What I've noticed in the last year is that bishops are speaking out and they're being bold they're not so much naming names as sort of saying, how could anybody vote for somebody whose father was a dictator? I mean, it's sort of, they're saying it without saying it, if you know what I mean,
Yeah.
So the church is standing up a bit. They're speaking out.
So there are signs of hope, which is good, because marriages of convenience, especially political convenience, are inconvenient for most. Well, Paul, thank you very much for sharing your insights and knowledge about the history of the Philippine Church with us today. And we look forward to talking to you again at a later date. Thank you. We've been speaking with Paul Glynn in the Philippines, and I'm Jim Mulroney.